Hello everyone and welcome back to my sunroom on this beautiful March day here in East Tennessee. Today I'm going to talk about growing orchids in bark and in moss. I've been asked many times recently if I mix the two together and how I know which ones to grow in moss and which ones to grow in bark. My decision is based on which one is better for the type of orchid I'm growing, and it's also based on the ease and frequency of watering that is easier for me. One of my biggest goals is to water most of my orchids once a week. Your environment and your goals will be different than mine, and sometimes it takes experimenting to see which one works best for you. So I'm going to go over bark first. I use Orchids bark primarily. It's a hardwood, durable bark, and my orchids do great in it. It's New Zealand Pinus radiata bark. It's antibacterial and pH balanced to keep the bark from going acidic. It's treated with dolomite, which is a naturally occurring source of calcium and magnesium, to prevent transplant shock. I've never had one orchid suffer from transplant shock that is in the Orchids bark, which is amazing. I'm really happy with the results I get when I use it. I found that the medium-sized chip Orchids bark is the best for my environment, and I use it on my large Phalaenopsis orchids and with my dendrobiums that are currently growing in bark. When I repot in Orchids bark, the orchid acclimates to its home very quickly. It starts growing very quickly. For the first few weeks, I might water every 4 or 5 days, depending on how humid it is when I repot. But once they're established in the bark, unless we have very cold or very hot weather, I water them once a week. I used to grow phals in a different brand bark with larger chunks, and it took longer for them to acclimate, meaning to establish itself in the pot, and I had to water more often because of the larger chunk bark, more like twice a week. Now I do water my dendrobiums twice a week. They need more water, but I don't want to water my entire collection, including my phals, twice a week. Orchids comes in many different sizes, from extra small to large, so you can choose any size that suits your environment and your needs. For instance, the extra small to the small size would be great for miniatures, and the large would be really good for larger phals or for vandas. And I buy the Orchids bark on Amazon. Another question I'm asked often is, can I repot the orchid I just bought in moss into bark? And the answer is yes, definitely. You can do that. I've done that many times before. Another question I'm asked really often is, do I soak the Orchids bark before I use it? The answer is no, I really don't. You can if you want to, but I wouldn't soak it for days because it's going to wash the dolomite off of the bark. But what I do is I just repot, and then I run water through that pot for 2 or 3 minutes just to make sure that it's really good and saturated. If I use the Better Grow Orchid Mix, which is another one that I've used in the past, I soak it for 3 or 4 days, because if I don't, I'm going to be watering them really often that first month. I like the Better Grow Orchid Mix, but the fact that I have to soak it for so long, sometimes when I get in a repotting mood, I'm really wanting to go ahead and get that orchid repotted, and the Orchids bark saves me time because I don't have to soak it before I use it. So that is a real plus about the Orchids bark. Now let's talk about moss. And those of you who watch my channel know my Cattleya has been in moss for almost 20 years now, and this is how I learned how to grow an orchid in New Zealand sphagnum moss. I use Best Grow New Zealand sphagnum moss, and I even try to sprout it before I use it when I can. Orchid grade premium moss, like the New Zealand sphagnum moss I use, is amazing to grow orchids in. It has antibacterial and antifungal properties as well, and you need the right environment to be able to grow well in moss. It's really easy to overwater, and that can cause problems. In very damp, humid environments, it can turn moldy, but in my environment, it's perfect. I'm really careful not to overwater my orchids in moss. If you tend to overwater, moss is not going to be a good option for you. It will turn mushy and grow algae, and your roots will not like it. Moss grows everywhere in my environment here in East Tennessee. It's everywhere I look, and I know the conditions that moss likes, and it takes practice to grow orchids in moss. I like to grow my miniature Phalaenopsis, my miniature Dendrobiums, and as you see, my mini Cattleya in moss. I don't have to water more than once a week, and sometimes I can go even longer. It just depends on the weather. I just checked to see if the Best Grow is available on Amazon, and it isn't at this time. But there are other brands of New Zealand sphagnum moss available. Just be sure that it's not brown basket moss. That is not orchid grade moss. You're looking specifically for orchid grade premium moss. Better Grow has orchid grade sphagnum moss. It's from South America, and I've used that, and it is very good to use as well. So do I ever mix my moss and my bark together? No, it just doesn't work for me. Since my goal is to water my orchids once a week, when I grow in either bark or in moss, I can do that. If I mix the two, I find that I end up with something that looks like either mush or concrete. When it gets very humid here in the summer, I end up with mush. And when it gets very cold in the winter and the humidity plummets, then I end up with just cement. So in my environment, mixing the two doesn't give me a good result at all. So the best way for you to know which medium or which mix works best for you is to try. Try one orchid with either a mix or with bark or with moss and see what happens. Experiment to see what works best for you in your environment. If you live in an environment like my friend Sharon in Arizona, she grows all of her orchids in moss. If you grow orchids in a damp, humid environment like my friend Sue in the UK, she grows mostly in bark and in bark mixes. Everyone grows slightly differently. That's the secret to growing orchids. You have to figure out by trial and error what works for you in your environment. And I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you're having a beautiful springtime, and I'd love to say the blessing over you, your family, and your orchids. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you his shalom peace. Make it a great day, and we'll see you all next time.